Alicia Carter, one of the youngest African-American FBI agents, had just finished a long, tiring meeting with her team. Alicia had worked hard to get where she was. She had proven herself time and time again, and her skills in criminal investigation were unmatched. Today, however, wasn't about work. She was off the clock and wearing jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a baseball cap. Alicia just wanted to enjoy her day off, get some coffee, and relax in her favorite spot at the park. The neighborhood was a nice mix of suburban charm and small-town feel. After parking her car, Alicia grabbed her phone and wallet and locked the door behind her as she made her way to the cafe's entrance. As she walked in, the doorbell rang, and she was greeted by the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the soft murmur of other customers enjoying their afternoon. She went to the counter and ordered a caramel latte, then found a seat by the window to watch the people walking by enjoy the sun. About 10 minutes had passed, and Alicia had only taken a few sips of her drink when a police car pulled into the parking lot. At first, she didn't pay much attention. She thought it was probably just another officer taking a break, but when the officer got out of the car and looked at her, she noticed something strange. His eyes lingered on her for a moment too long, and the officer, a tall, stocky white man with a stern face, walked straight into the cafe and started talking. The other customers were quietly watching as the officer walked up to her. He stalked right at her table, his hands on his hips, and his gaze was fixed on her. "Sir," he said in a tone that made it clear this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Can I see some ID?" Alicia raised her eyebrows, surprised but calm. She had worked in law enforcement herself, so she knew what was going on. Still, she couldn't help but wonder what it was all about. She asked him in a steady, polite voice. He looked at her close and narrowed his eyes in suspicion. "I've had some complaints about someone matching your description loitering in this area," he said. Alicia felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. She was just sitting in a cafe minding her own business like everyone else. No one else was being questioned. She looked around and saw stares from some other customers and felt her stomach drop. Was this really happening? "I'm just having a..." The officer's eyes hardened as she asked, "Are you refusing to cooperate, ma'am?" Alicia took a deep breath. She wasn't in the mood for a fight, but she also wasn't going to let herself be bullied. This was ridiculous. "No, I'm not refusing," she said, "but I'd like to know why you're targeting me when I'm clearly not doing anything wrong." The officer's jaw tightened, he leaned in a little, and his voice dropped. "Look, you can make this easy or you can make this hard, but I need to see some ID now." Alicia sighed and reached for her wallet, pulling out her driver's license. She gave it to him and watched as he looked at it with a dismissive glance. He didn't seem interested in reading it properly. Instead, he handed it back to her with a smirk. "Are you from around here?" he asked in a condescending tone. "Does it matter?" she shot back, her patience wearing thin. The officer's face turned darkened as she spoke. "Just answer the question," Alicia felt. She felt a temper flare, but she didn't lose control because she knew what was going on. He didn't see a law-abiding citizen sitting quietly in a cafe. He saw a black woman who didn't belong, at least in his mind. Before she could answer, the officer stepped back and put his hand on his radio. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," he said in a loud voice that everyone in the cafe could hear. Alicia stared at him in shock. "Come with me for what?" "I haven't done anything wrong." "Protests?" "We can handle it down at the station," he said in a cold, unbending tone. The cafe became quiet as everyone's attention was drawn to what was happening in front of them. Alicia felt her heart racing with anger. She had dealt with situations like this before, where people made assumptions about her based on how she looked, but this was different. It was embarrassing, and he was doing it in front of everyone. She took a deep breath and told herself she was strong enough to handle it, but she was still upset. She knew she had to be careful because she didn't want things to get worse. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, "unless you have a legitimate reason to detain me. I'll finish my coffee and leave on my own terms." The officer's face turned red with anger, and he took a step closer, his posture intimidating. "I'm not asking, ma'am, I'm telling you," he said, "Alicia." Her fingers twitched, but she stayed calm. "This isn't over by a long shot," she told the officer at a low but firm tone. Alicia could feel her heart beat faster as the officer walked up to her, his eyes filled with anger and pride. He had no idea who she was or how much power she had, and she knew it, but she kept her cool. This wasn't the time to play her hand. Alicia had spent years learning how to be patient in situations just like this. The officer's face was now inches from hers, and his cocky voice made things worse. "You can either come quietly, or I'll make this difficult," he said. A few people in the cafe moved uncomfortably in their seats. Some watched with wide eyes, while others looked away, clearly uncomfortable. No one spoke up for her, though. Alicia noticed the silence and felt its weight. She was alone in this moment with a man who thought he had all the power. She had been in the FBI long enough to know that one wrong move could send things out of control, but she wasn't going to back down either. Keeping her voice calm, "Officer, I'm not going anywhere with you until you tell me what crime I'm being accused of. You have no right to take me in." The officer's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially by someone he thought was beneath him. Alicia could tell he was angry from the way his chest puffed out a little more and the way his fingers twitched near his holster. She wasn't going to lose her cool for him. "You're resisting an officer," he said, his voice getting louder. I was resisting because Alicia hadn't even moved from her seat. She was just sitting there minding her own business in a coffee shop, and now this man wanted to throw her in the back of his patrol car for no good reason. She clenched her fists under the table, her anger bubbling just below the surface, but she knew she shouldn't let it show. Before she could answer, the officer's radio went off. He grabbed it from his shoulder and held it to his ear while another voice spoke quickly over the static. Alicia couldn't understand what was being said, but the officer's face changed slightly, as if he were thinking about something. He looked at Alicia again, clearly debating what to do next. There was a long pause as he listened to the radio, and Alicia used the time to take a look around her. People were still watching, but now their interest seemed to have turned into discomfort. The tension in the room was palpable, and the usually friendly and chatty cafe staff were exchanging glances as they tried to figure out what to do. After a short time, the officer put down his radio and looked at her again. His face was once again smug, and Alicia knew he wasn't going to back down easily. "Looks like you're in luck," he said with a smug tone. "I've got another call to answer, but don't think this is over. I'm keeping my eye on you." He turned on his heel and walked out of the cafe, his boots stomping loudly as he made his way back to the patrol car. Alicia watched as he got in and drove off. As the officer's car disappeared around the corner, Alicia let out a long, slow breath. The tension in the cafe didn't go away right away, but after a few moments, conversations started up again, though they were much quieter than before. She could still feel the weight of the other customers on the stairs, some of whom looked at her with sympathy and others with discomfort, but none of them had said a word during the whole thing. Alicia took the sip of her now. Even though her hands were shaking from the cold coffee, she wasn't scared. She was angry, furious, even, but she knew she had to keep her cool. This wasn't the first time she had dealt with a situation like this, and it wouldn't be the last. But the shame of it all, the fact that it was public, and the officer's clear bias hurt her deeply. She could feel her phone buzzing in her pocket, but she ignored it for a moment to calm down. She needed a moment to breathe and think about what had just happened. Finally, she took out her phone and looked at the screen. There were several missed calls from her co-worker Agent Stevens, as well as a few messages asking about their upcoming case brief. Alicia sighed. The timing couldn't have been worse. She wasn't sure she was ready to go back to work after what had happened, but she had to. She sent Stevens a quick text message to let him know she was okay and would catch up with him later. She needed to clear her head and figure out what to do next. Alicia knew she couldn't ignore the situation with the officer. It was about more than just her pride. It was about accountability. She picked up her coffee and was determined to finish it, even though she felt uneasy. She didn't want to be driven out by the actions of one ignorant officer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time she'd see him. As she sat there, her mind raced. She could report him, but that would only be a short-term fix. There was a bigger problem than just one bad cop that needed to be dealt with, but Alicia was used to working in the background, gathering evidence, and letting her work speak for itself. She didn't like being the center of attention, but maybe now was the time to change that? Maybe this was her chance to do something bigger than herself. Alicia's phone rang again, and this time she answered Stevens. She said in a steady voice, "We need to talk." Alicia hung up the phone, her mind already racing with thoughts about what had just happened. She still couldn't get over her interaction with the officer. It was too raw and real to forget. She couldn't believe someone with so much power could treat people that way without knowing anything about them. But Alicia had seen this pattern too many times. It wasn't just one man with a badge. It was a system that let people like him get away with it. She racked her fingers on the table as she thought about her options. She wasn't going to let this go, but she also knew she had to be smart. Alicia wasn't just thinking about herself. She was also thinking about how many other people had been mistreated, humiliated, or even worse because of this officer's unchecked power. Before she could get too deep into her thoughts, the cafe door swung open. She tensed for a moment, expecting to see the officer return, but instead a familiar figure walked in, her colleague Agent Stevens. Stevens's tall, lean frame was easy to spot, and as soon as he saw Alicia, he went straight for her. Stevens pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with a worried look on his face. "I got your text message. What happened?" Alicia leaned back in her chair and wrapped her hands around her now warm coffee. She didn't want to go over the details again, but she knew Stevens needed to know. "I had a run-in with a local cop," she said in a measured voice. "He tried to arrest me for no reason." Stevens' eyebrows shot up. "What? Why didn't you flash your badge?" Steven asked. It wouldn't have made a difference. He just saw what he wanted to see. Alicia sighed. "This is getting out of hand." Alicia thought for a moment, her eyes drifting to the cafe window where she could see people going about their day without knowing what she had just been through. The officer was gone, but his presence still lingered in her mind. "I'm not sure yet," she said finally, "but I know I need to take action. I can't just let him get away with this." Stevens agreed. "This isn't just about you, Alicia. This guy could be doing this to other people, maybe people who don't have the resources to fight back," she said quietly. "That's what bothers me the most." The tension between them broke when Stevens cleared his throat. "We've got that big case briefing later," he said, trying to change the subject a bit. "If you need time to deal with this, I can handle it," he added. Alicia shook her head. "No, I'll be there. This is important, but so is the case." "I can't let it distract me from my job," Stevens said, leaning forward in his voice. A softer voice said, "Just don't lose sight of what matters. We've got your back if you need anything." Alicia gave him a small smile of thanks, but her mind was already racing again. Stevens was right. She needed to stay focused on the task at hand, but she couldn't ignore what had just happened. She wasn't the type to brush things under the rug, and this officer had crossed a line that she couldn't ignore. Stevens looked at his watch and said, "I better go back to the office." Alicia agreed. Stevens stood up and gave her a reassuring nod before leaving the cafe. Alicia watched him leave and then turned her attention back to the street outside. She had to make a choice. Part of her wanted to find that officer and confront him directly, but she knew that wouldn't solve anything. This was more than just one confrontation. She had to go through the right channels if she wanted real change. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the FBI's internal system. It was a reminder about. Alicia had been working on a high-profile investigation for weeks, and they were finally ready to present their findings. She couldn't be distracted by personal issues now, not with so much at stake. But no matter how hard she tried to concentrate on her work, the officer's face kept flashing in her mind. She couldn't get rid of the image of his smug face and how he had treated her like she was nothing. Alicia knew this wasn't just about her, it was about standing up for what was right. She looked at her watch and saw that she had some time before the briefing. She knew exactly what she had to do. Alicia got up, grabbed her coat, and walked out of the cafe. The cool breeze hit her face, bringing her back to the present. As she walked down the street, she didn't have a plan yet, but she knew where to start. She needed to gather information. She had dealt with many officers in the past, both good and bad, and she knew how to work within the system to get what she wanted. As she walked, her thoughts changed. When she was training with the FBI, one of the most important things she learned was how to handle tough situations without letting her emotions get the best of her. She couldn't let her anger cloud her judgment. This had to be handled carefully, with precision and strategy. She walked steadily to the local police precinct, knowing that if she was going to do something, she had to start here. Alicia wasn't planning to make a scene or confront the officer directly, at least not yet. She needed to gather the evidence first. She needed to know who this officer was, what his record looked like, and if he had a history of acting this way before. As Alicia walked up to the precinct, she felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't just about what had happened to her, it was about making sure no one else had to go through the same thing. She pushed open the door and walked inside, ready to start the next part of her plan. Alicia stood at the entrance to the police precinct, feeling the cool air on her face as she thought for a moment. Even though this wasn't her first time in a precinct, something about this felt different. She wasn't here as an FBI agent, at least not yet. She was just a citizen who had been mistreated by someone who should have been serving and protecting her. She put her badge away for now and took a deep breath as she walked through the heavy doors. The atmosphere changed right away as she entered the precinct, where officers were coming and going and phones were ringing and voices were mixing. Alicia looked around the room. She was looking for someone who could help her without drawing too much attention to herself. At the front desk, there was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. Alicia approached her calmly, keeping her demeanor professional but firm. "Excuse me," she said, getting the woman's attention. "I need some information about one of your officers." The woman raised an eyebrow and looked at Alicia, as if to see who she was. "Who might you be?" Alicia asked. Offering a polite smile, she said, "I had an encounter with an officer earlier today, and I'd like to follow up." The woman leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "What kind of encounter are we talking about?" Alicia asked. "I'd rather not get into too many details here. I just need to know the officer's name." The woman gave her a hard look before sighing and turning to her computer. "Okay, what time and where was this supposed encounter earlier this?" Alicia answered and gave a brief description of the officer, tall, stocky, with a shaved head and an attitude that oozed arrogance. The woman's fingers clacked across the keyboard for a moment before she stopped and glanced back at Alicia. "You're talking about Officer Donnelly," she said, her voice neutral but with a hint of irritation. "Been with the department for a few years now." Alicia nodded, writing down the name Officer Don. Now she had something solid to work with. "Thank you," she said calmly. The woman gave her a half-hearted nod before turning back to her computer. Alicia didn't stay long. She had what she needed right away, and hanging out at the precinct wasn't going to help. As she walked back outside into the daylight, her mind was already working over the details Officer Donnelly. She knew she could look up his records through the FBI's internal system, but for now she had enough to start putting things together. If this guy had been acting strangely around her, he had probably done it to people who weren't able to fight back before. Alicia walked toward her parked car a few blocks away. The street was pretty quiet, with only a few people walking their dogs and a few kids riding bikes, but Alicia's mind was on what she needed to do next. This wasn't just about reporting a bad cop. She needed to hold someone responsible for their actions and make sure it didn't happen again. When she got back to her car, she pulled out her phone and called. Stevens picked up the phone after the second ring and asked, "Did you get what you needed?" Alicia said, "Officer Donnelly." "Have you ever heard of him?" Stevens paused for a moment, thinking, "No, I haven't." Alicia replied, "I want to see what I can find on my own first, but keep this guy on your radar. He's got a bad attitude, and I'm not sure it's a one-time thing." Stevens hummed in agreement. "Just be careful. These local guys can get really defensive." Alicia smirked and said, "I know, but I'm not backing down." "I didn't think you would." Stevens laughed. "Just keep me in the loop." "We'll do that," Alicia said as she hung up the phone. Alicia leaned back in her seat and took a deep breath. She was still angry about how Donnelly had treated her, but now she had a plan. It wasn't just about how Donnelly had treated her, it was about the bigger picture, the fact that someone like him could wear a badge and feel like they were above the law. He had every right to do what he wanted. Alicia knew the system inside and out because she had worked for the FBI and seen both sides of the law. There were officers who cared about their communities and treated people with respect, but there were others, like Donnelly, who used their power to put others down and hurt them, and that was something she couldn't stand to see. The drive back to the FBI field office was short, but it gave Alicia time to gather her thoughts by. As she pulled into the parking lot, she had a better idea of what she needed to do next. First, she would check Donnell's record. If there were any complaints or incidents in his file, it would give her more power to deal with his behavior. Alicia walked into the cool, clean field office and went to her desk. She logged into her computer and quickly navigated through the system to access local police records. It didn't take long for her to find Officer Donnell's file. She quickly looked through it. The screen showed the usual information about Don's years of service and awards, but then she saw something that made her stop and think. There were a few complaints on file, mostly minor but enough to raise a red flag. They were from civilians and were mostly about Don's attitude, how he treated people while they were being arrested, and his general lack of respect for basic rules. Nothing had come of the complaints, of course, and they were all marked as results with no further action. Alicia frowned. This was exactly what she had expected. It wasn't just about one bad apple. Don had a pattern, and the system had let it slide before, but she didn't think that this time would be different. The next morning, Alicia got to the FBI office early to continue her investigation into Officer Donnelly. The events of the previous day were still fresh in her mind, and she wasn't going to let his behavior go unnoticed. She had seen officers like him before, people who thought their badge gave them the right to treat others badly, but Alicia wasn't a civilian, she was an FBI agent, and she wasn't going to let this happen. Alicia sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and started her search. She was looking through the FBI's internal database. She could feel the weight of the task ahead of her. She had to make sure she built a strong case not only for herself but for everyone who had been affected by Donnelly's abuse of power. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she looked through records from not only Donnelly's precinct but the whole district. What she found was disturbing. Over the last 2 years there, several people, mostly people of color, had filed complaints against Officer Donnelly for mistreatment during traffic stops or casual interactions. Each complaint had been thrown out or said to lack evidence. Alicia clenched her teeth. It was a common pattern for victims not to be believed and for Donnelly's word to be taken as law. But that was about to change. Alicia knew that these complaints could paint a clear picture of wrongdoing in the right hands. She didn't want to involve her bosses just yet, but if things got worse, she would. Alicia spent the next couple of hours gathering more evidence. She called some of the people who had filed complaints and introduced herself as a concerned citizen, but she hadn't told them she worked for the FBI yet. Each of them told a similar story. Officer Donnelly had been rude and aggressive without reason, and he made them feel small and powerless during their interactions with him. None of them had seen justice. When she finished talking to the last person on her list, Alicia leaned back in her chair. She felt a strong sense of determination wash over her. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was about holding people accountable and making sure that someone like Donnelly couldn't keep abusing his power without being caught. Just as she was finishing up her research for the day, her phone rang. It was Stevens. "Hey, any updates?" he asked, his voice a little less serious than usual. "Yeah, I've been looking into him," she replied, quickly scanning her screen. "This guy has a history. There are multiple complaints against him from." Not surprisingly, Stevens said with a sigh, guys like him know how to play the system. They push just far enough to scare people but not far enough to get in real trouble. Alicia agreed, "That's what I'm seeing here. But it's going to stop. I've already started talking to some of the people who filed complaints, and their stories are consistent. We're building a case. Do you think he has any higher-ups covering for him?" Stevens asked, his tone changing. Although Alicia said, "I wouldn't be surprised," she wasn't sure yet. "He's been getting away with it for a while now, though, and from what I'm seeing, his behavior is getting worse. It's only a matter of time before he crosses a line that he can't come back from." Stevens was quiet for a moment, then he spoke again. "Be careful, Alicia. If he finds out you're digging into him, he might try to retaliate. Guys like him don't like being exposed." "I know," Alicia said, her voice firm, "but I'm not backing down. You ever do." Stevens laughed. "Just keep your head. Okay, you're good at what you do, but don't get too caught up in it. We've seen agents lose their cool when they get too involved in a case, and I hear you, Alicia. I'll be careful." After hanging up the phone, Alicia thought about Stevens' words. He was right. It was easy to let your emotions get the best of you when you were involved in a case, but Alicia wasn't going to let that happen. She was going to do this the right way by gathering evidence, staying calm, and using the system to help her. Over the course of the day, Alicia decided it was time to make her presence known at Dawn's precinct. She wasn't going to confront Donnelly directly, but she wanted to see how things worked from the inside. She wore casual clothes to try to blend in as much as possible, and when she got there, it was just as busy as the day before. She could see officers talking, paperwork being shuffled, and the general hustle of police work. One face stood out, Donnelly. He was standing next to the coffee machine and chatting with another officer with a smug grin on his face. Alicia watched him for a moment from across the room. He carried himself with an air of entitlement as if he owned the place. She could tell by the way the other officers interacted with him that Donnelly had some power in the precinct, maybe even some fear. He was the type of person who thought he could do no wrong and believed that his badge made him untouchable. Alicia resisted the urge to. It wasn't the right time or place to go up to him and confront him right then and there. Instead, she took a deep breath and went back to the front desk. The same woman from the day before was there, looking just as uninterested as ever. Again, she asked, not even looking up from her computer. "Are you following up on some things?" Alicia asked. "Is Officer Donnelly around?" The woman gave Donnelly a quick glance while he was still talking by the coffee machine. "He's over there," Alicia said, but she pretended not to. She carefully avoided drawing Donnell's attention as she slowly made her way around the precinct. She wasn't ready to reveal herself yet. For now she just needed to observe to learn more about the environment he thrived in. The more she knew, the better she would be prepared to confront him when the time came. Alicia left the precinct that day with more questions than answers. She had seen Officer Donnelly up close, watched how he carried himself, and watched how his co-workers interacted with him. He seemed proud. Alicia knew that competent, untouchable people like Donnelly always slipped up eventually. The key was to be patient and know when to strike. The next morning, Alicia sipped her coffee in the kitchen while looking at the notes she had taken. Her laptop was open and showed the profiles of some of the people who had filed complaints against Donnelly. The stories were all too familiar. Black men and women who had been pulled over for minor offenses and verbally abused or humiliated, some of them had been. Everyone who had been wronged by police officers like Donnelly felt helpless against the system that protected him. Alicia had to remind herself to stay calm. She wasn't just fighting for her own pride, she was fighting for everyone. But she also knew she couldn't make any mistakes. Everything had to be done exactly as written. When she finished her coffee, she got ready for the day and went back to the office. The investigation into Donnelly had taken up most of her time over the past week, but Alicia knew it was worth it. Alicia was deep in research when her phone rang in the middle of the morning. It was one of the civilians she had talked to the day before, a man named James who had been pulled over by Donnelly a few months earlier. "Hey, it's James," James said. "I've been thinking about what we talked about yesterday. I wasn't sure if I should say this, but something's been bothering me." Alicia sat up, curious. "Well, James," she asked. "When Donnelly pulled me over, he kept saying things that made it sound like he knew personal things about me. At first, I thought he was just trying to scare me, but the more I think about it, the stranger it seems. He brought up my job and family things I don't usually talk about." Alicia frowned and asked if I had asked him how he knew. "I did, and he laughed. James said he didn't give me a straight answer." Alicia's mind was racing. This wasn't just about pulling people over and showing his strength if Donnell was using personal. It was a whole different level of violation for her to find out where he was getting this information. "Thanks for telling me, James," Alicia said in a serious voice. "This could be important. I'm going to look into it. If anything else comes to mind, don't hesitate to reach out." After hanging up the phone, Alicia started to look into it right away. She looked at Donnell's recent cases for patterns. If he was targeting specific people, it might show up in his activity. As she scrolled through As Alicia looked through the records for the next few hours, she noticed a disturbing pattern. Donnelly seemed to pull over the same types of people over and over again. These people were usually African American, had good jobs, and were involved in their communities. They weren't the typical day targets that bad cops usually went after, so why was he picking them out? It wasn't long before she found something even more troubling. Donnelly wasn't just using his position to harass people on the street, he was also looking at personal and employment records. This was wrong and dangerous because it showed that he knew personal information about people like James, and it also made her wonder what Donnelly was really up to. Her heart sank when she realized that what she had found was much more than just humiliation. Donnelly was abusing his power in ways that went far beyond a typical bad cop. He was looking into people's private lives probably for no good reason. Alicia was thinking when someone knocked on her door. Stevens walked in and asked, "How's it going?" He noticed the serious look on her face and said, "I found something big," pointing to the screen. Donnell's been accessing personal records of people he pulls over. This is more than just bad behavior. He's using his position to target specific people and he's violating their privacy. Stevens raised an eyebrow and said, "That's serious. Do you think he's working alone?" Alicia replied, "I'm not sure yet," Stevens replied, "but it doesn't look good if he's doing this without anyone else." Stevens leaned against the desk and thought, "We need to be careful with this. If you go in too hot, he'll find out, and we don't want him to cover his tracks. We need solid proof before we take this any further." He knew Alicia was keeping her voice steady, but she wasn't going to let him keep doing this. She was going to find out how far this goes. Stevens nodded and said, "Just be smart about it. We don't want to spook him." As Stevens left the office, Alicia turned back to her. She knew what could happen if she tried to do too much too soon, but every second that passed meant more people could be targeted. She had to be careful, but she also knew she couldn't let this go on for too long. Over the next few days, Alicia continued her investigation carefully, gathering evidence without drawing too much attention to herself. She set up meetings with a few more people who had filed complaints, each of whom added another layer to the story she was building. With each conversation, it became clearer that Donnelly wasn't just a bully, he was. Alicia still didn't know why, but she was getting closer. One afternoon, after talking to a woman who had been harassed by Donnelly, Alicia got an email from someone in the IT department who owed her a favor. The message was simple. They had tracked Donnelly's activity in the system and confirmed that he had accessed personal records without permission. Alicia's heart raced as she read it. She was finally getting closer. There was still more work to be done before she could bring this to a head. Donnelly was playing a risky game, and Alicia needed to make sure she had all the pieces in place before she moved. Alicia knew she was getting closer to revealing Officer Donnelly's whole plan, but there was still a lot she didn't know. The fact that he was illegally accessing personal records was enough to get him in big trouble, but she needed to find out why he was going after these specific records. Alicia spent hours going through her notes trying to figure out what was going on. Everyone she talked to had a similar story about being pulled over for a minor reason, being embarrassed, and not being given a clear reason as to why. But it was Donnelly's personal information that stood out the most. It seemed like he was targeting people based on more than just their race or social status. One morning, while going through her files, Alicia decided to dig deeper. She had looked into Donnelly's personal history before because she wanted to make sure she had enough evidence first, but now she felt she had to. She needed to know who he was before he became a police officer. She sat at her desk, typed in his name, and pulled up old records. What she found wasn't surprising, but it was still unsettling. Donnelly came from a long line of police officers, many of whom had worked in the same department for generations. His father and grandfather had both worked in the precinct, and it was clear that Donnelly felt a lot of entitlement because of his family's history, but that wasn't the only thing that caught Alicia's attention. As she read through the records, she found some complaints against his father, who had retired 10 years before. These complaints were eerily similar to the ones against Donnelly, who was accused of racism, sexual harassment, and abuse of power. It seemed like Donnelly was carrying out a family tradition of using his badge to control people, especially those who couldn't easily fight back. Alicia She felt the weight of what she had learned as she leaned back in her chair. It wasn't just about one bad cop, it was about a culture of abuse that had been passed down through generations. She knew that bringing Donnelly down would not only expose him, but it could also potentially shake up the whole department. The thought made her both nervous and determined. Later that day, Alicia met up with Stevens again to talk about what she had found. I looked into Donnell's background, she told him as they sat down at a cafe near their office. It's like Donnelly is carrying on the family tradition of racial harassment and abuse of power. Stevens sighed and took a sip of his coffee. That doesn't surprise me. I've seen guys who think they're untouchable because they come from a line of cops and don't think the rules apply to them. Alicia nodded, but we need to be careful. This isn't just about Donnelly anymore. If we push too hard, we might find out more than we bargained for, and I don't know how deep the problem goes. If there's a problem with the culture in that department, it needs to be brought to light. We're not just going after Donnelly. We're going after the system that lets guys like him get away with it. Alicia appreciated Stevens' support. She knew that this investigation could make waves, but she was determined to see it through. She couldn't stand by while people like Donnelly abused their power. Too many lives were at risk over the next few days. Alicia looked into Donnell's cases more and talked to more people who had been harassed by him. Each person had a different story about how Donnelly had used his position to make fun of them, but Alicia noticed that there was a pattern. He seemed to target people who were respected in the community and had something to lose. It was as if he liked putting them down to show them that no matter how successful they were still flawed. Alicia's anger grew with each new story she heard. She knew that Donald's actions were just a symptom of a bigger problem, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with the people he hurt. They weren't just numbers. They were real people whose lives were being ruined by a man who thought he was above the law. One afternoon, Alicia got a call from someone she had talked to earlier. It was Regina, a small business owner who had been pulled over by Donald 6 months earlier. Regina was reluctant to share details at first. I've been thinking a lot about what happened since Regina called me on the phone, and I realized that Dolly wasn't just pulling me over for speeding. He was asking me personal questions as if he knew who I was, and he said that he had seen me around town before. Alicia's ears perked up. What do you mean, did he say how he knew you? Regina replied, but the way he was talking, it felt like he'd been watching me. It wasn't just a random stop. It felt like he wanted to remind me who you are. Alicia's stomach turned because this was the second time she had heard something like this. The first time was from James. Now Regina. Donnelly wasn't just pulling people over for minor offenses. He was targeting them, and he seemed to be gathering information on them beforehand. Thank you for telling me this, Regina, Alicia said. It helps a lot. I'm going to keep looking into it. After hanging up the phone, Alicia sat in silence for a moment, trying to figure out what was going on. Donnelly was clearly going after certain people for a reason, but she couldn't figure it out. Still couldn't figure out what he had to gain. Was it just power, or was there something darker going on? As Alicia worked on the case, she became more and more invested. It wasn't just another assignment, it was personal. She knew what it was like to be embarrassed by Donnelly and wasn't going to let him get away with it. But she knew she had to be patient. The case was building, and soon Donnelly would slip up, and when he did, Alicia would be ready. As the days went by, the investigation grew heavier. The more she looked into it, the more she learned that Donnelly wasn't just a robed cop working alone. There were deeper connections within the police department, officers who looked the other way, reports that had been seriously mishandled, and complaints that were never followed up on. It became clear that Donnell's behavior wasn't just about one man abusing his power. It was about a broken system that let people like him thrive. Alicia sat at her desk and went through the files again. She kept thinking about the conversation she'd had with Regina and why Donnelly was harassing business owners and people with power in the community. It didn't seem random. but he was doing it on purpose, and she couldn't figure out his motives. Alicia leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind. She thought about how Donnelly had put her down and talked down to her, as if she were less important than him. He liked having control over her and how he could make her feel small with just a few words. It wasn't just about race, it was about control. He wanted to remind her and people like her that no matter how successful they would always be below him. Stevens knocked on the door and handed her one of the coffee cups. "Thanks," Alicia said. Stevens sat down across from her and said, "You're not the only one." He had been looking into Donnell's old cases and found something interesting. He's been questioning a lot of people who were involved in community projects, business owners, charity organizers, and people with power. It's almost like he's going after people who could reveal something. Alicia frowned and asked, "What do you think he's trying to conceal?" Stephen replied, "It's possible. If he has dirt on these people, he might use it to his advantage." Alicia's mind raced. That made sense. Dolly wasn't just bothering these people for fun, he was probably gathering information on them to keep them in line. If they were afraid of him, they wouldn't speak out against him, and he could keep doing what he was doing without anyone standing in his way. Alicia said, "We need to find out what he's using this information for if we can." Stevens agreed, but warned, if he knows we're onto him, he could destroy any evidence he has. Over the next few days, they worked hard to talk to more people who had been targeted by Dixon. Each conversation gave them a little more information about how he worked. He wasn't just pulling people over for traffic violations, he was also asking them about their businesses, families, and finances. It was clear that he was trying to get information that would help them catch him. Alicia and Stevens decided to visit one of Don's former victims, a man named Marcus who owned a popular restaurant in town. Marcus had been pulled over by Donnelly a few months ago for what he thought was a routine traffic stop. During the stop, Donnelly started asking him questions about his business, his customers, and even his employees. At the time, Marcus thought it was strange, but he hadn't given it much thought. Now that he thinks about it, he realizes that Donnelly was looking for information. When Alicia and Stevens walked into Marcus' restaurant, it was busy and warm. Marcus, a tall man with a friendly smile, led them to a quiet corner where they could talk. "I've been thinking a lot about that stop," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "At first I just thought Donnelly was being nosy, but now I realize he was looking for something." "Did he ever contact you after that?" Alicia asked. Marcus shook his head no, Marcus replied. "But I did notice something strange a few weeks after the stop. Started getting calls from city inspectors who were coming by more often to look for violations and ask questions about my permits. It felt like they were trying to find something wrong with my business." Alicia and Stevens looked at each other and agreed that this was exactly what they had thought. Donnelly wasn't just picking on random people. He was setting them up for harassment and using his power to make things worse for anyone he saw as a threat. "Had you ever had any problems with the police or city officials before?" Stevens asked Marcus. Marcus shook his head no, never. My business has always been in good standing, but after that stop, it was like I had a target on my back. I started getting visits from all kinds of officials, and I've had to spend a lot of money just to keep everything in order." Alicia felt angry. Donnelly wasn't just pulling people over, he was using his power to ruin their lives by going after their businesses and ways of making a living, and he was doing it with the help of other people in the system. "Thank you for telling us this," Alicia said. Marcus nodded. "I hope you can do something about him. People in the community are scared because they know what he can do, but no one feels like they can do anything about it." "We're working on it," Stevens said. "We're not going to stop until we bring him down." As they left the restaurant, Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to the truth. Donald's network of influence was bigger than they thought. It was clear that he wasn't acting alone, but there was still one piece missing. What was his ultimate goal? Was it just power, or was there something more at stake? Alicia knew they were running out of time. The more they found out, the more dangerous things became. Donnelly wasn't afraid to protect himself, and if he felt threatened, he might do anything. The investigation became more important. Alicia and Stevens could feel the walls closing in on them, and they knew what they had to do. They had to move quickly before Denny found out what they were up to. The next step was to gather more proof that Denny was using his power to threaten and control people in the community. Alicia decided to talk to some local activists who had been speaking out against police brutality. If anyone knew anything about Donnelly's actions, it would be these activists. She set up a meeting with Maria, a well-known community leader who had been working for years to address issues of police brutality. When Alicia went to the small community center where Maria held meetings, she found a lively group of people talking about their plans for a rally. The air was full of energy and determination, and Alicia felt a surge of hope. These were people who weren't going to back down easily. "Thank you for meeting with us," Alicia said to Maria, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile and fierce determination in her eyes. "Of course we need to stick together if we want to bring about change," Maria replied. Motioned for Alicia and Stevens to join her at a table. Alicia told Maria about their investigation into Donnelly and how he had been targeting both business owners and activists. Maria listened carefully, her face changing from worry to anger as Alicia explained the details. Maria shook her head and said, "Donnelly is just one part of a bigger problem. There are officers in this department who think they can do whatever they want without consequences. We've had complaints filed against him before, but nothing ever happened." Stevens asked Maria, "Have you ever heard of him trying to gather information on anyone in the community?" Maria nodded, "Absolutely. I've seen it happen many times. He pulls people over for no reason and starts asking them about their lives. I know of a few people who have been asked about their work in activism in an attempt to intimidate them into silence." Alicia felt a chill down her spine. They weren't just dealing with an officer who abused his power, they were dealing with a culture of fear that kept people from speaking out. Alicia, eager to find more proof, asked, "Do you have any concrete examples?" Maria paused for a moment and then leaned forward. "There's a young man named Jamal who was organizing a youth program. Donnelly stalked him on his way home one night and started asking about his work, trying to intimidate him. Jamal later told me that he felt scared and thought Donnelly was looking for a way to get him in trouble. He stopped planning events after that." "That's exactly the kind of information we need," Stevens said. "If we can get Jamal to talk, it might help us build a stronger case." Maria agreed to contact Jamal and encourage him to talk to Alicia and Stevens. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about other possible witnesses and getting names of people who had been harassed by Donnelly in a similar way. Just as they were wrapping up, Stevens sent Alicia a text message saying, "Be careful, I think Donnelly is watching us." Alicia looked up, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" "I overheard a couple of officers talking. Earlier, they talked about keeping an eye on Busybody with the badge, which I think refers to you." Alicia was angry and scared. It was one thing to look into a corrupt officer, but it was another to be directly threatened. "We can't back down now," she said, trying to rally her resolve. "If we stop, we'll let him win that night." As she drove home, her mind raced with the weight of their mission. She had never thought she would be in such a dangerous situation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was. At home, Alicia made herself a cup of tea and sat down at her kitchen table with her notes. She started going over everything they had gathered so far and trying to make sense of the chaos. As she put it together, it became clearer that Donnelly was more than just a bad cop. He was a symbol of the bigger systemic problems at play. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, which startled Alicia. She put down her cup and cautiously walked to the door, peeping. Alicia looked through the peephole and was relieved to see Stevens. "Hey, I wasn't sure if you'd be home," he said as she opened the door, just trying to stay focused. "What's up?" "I wanted to go over our notes again. I think we're close to finding a solid lead, especially with Mo, but we have to move quickly before Donnelly finds out." Stevens agreed. "Let's go over everything one more time." As they talked, they highlighted connections and patterns in their notes. They were getting closer to finding out something important, but they also knew that Donnelly would defend himself if he felt threatened. As they worked late into the night, Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. Every noise outside made her heart race, and the shadows seemed to last longer in her small apartment. "Let's wrap this up for now," Stevens said, looking at the clock. "We'll meet with Maria and Jamal tomorrow and see what we can find out." Alicia agreed. But as she was getting ready to go to bed, she looked out her window one last time. She felt a wave of anxiety wash over her as she saw a police car slowly drive past her building. It stopped for a moment, its headlights shining on her apartment, and then it continued down the street. "Did you see that?" Alicia asked Stevens in a voice barely above a whisper. Stevens turned to look and saw that the police car was just parked outside. "Probably just a routine patrol," Alicia told Stevens. "Don't let it get to you," Alicia told Stevens. They had to be ready for whatever Donnelly might throw at them next. The next day started out bright and clear, but Alicia could feel a storm brewing inside her. She and Stevens were meeting with Jamal at the community center, and she knew that this meeting could change everything. They had to be careful, though, because Donnelly was still hiding in the shadows, and one wrong move could put them all in danger. As they drove to the community center, Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that every corner they turned and every passing car felt like a possible threat. She reminded herself to stick to the plan, and when they got there, Maria was waiting for them at a corner table. She waved them over with a determined look on her face. "Jamal is running a bit late," she said in a calm but serious voice. "He's a bit nervous about talking to you too." Stevens looked around the room and said, "We understand." It's not easy for him to trust anyone, especially with someone like Donnelly in the mix. Alicia nodded and said, "We're." Just then, the door opened and Jamal walked in. He looked around, uncertain, but when he saw Maria, he walked up to her and said, "Hey," barely above a whisper. "Thanks for coming, Jamal." Maria smiled and told him, "We're here to listen, no pressure." Jamal took a seat and looked at Alicia and Stevens with a mix of fear and interest. "I heard about what you're trying to do," he said slowly, "but I'm scared Donnelly has a way of making." Alicia leaned forward and said, "We understand that we're not here to put you in danger. We just want to gather information so we can hold him accountable." He hesitated, his eyes darting to the side as if he thought someone would burst in at any moment. "Okay, I'll share what I can, but you have to promise me that this won't get back to him at all," she said. "Your safety is our top priority." As Jamal began to speak, Alicia listened carefully as he talked about the time Donnelly had pulled him over for a minor offense. "He turned the traffic ticket into an interrogation by asking me about my friends and what I was doing in the neighborhood. It felt like he was trying to scare me into silence," Jamal said, his voice trembling a little. Alicia felt a knot form in her stomach. This was exactly what they had feared. Donnelly wasn't just a bad cop, he was making people afraid. Jamal talked about how he had stopped organizing youth programs because he felt watched, alone, and threatened. "I didn't want to cause trouble for my family," he said. Alicia's resolve grew stronger with each detail Jamal shared. They had to take this to the next level to get more witnesses and build a case that could stand up to any screw SCY. Jamal, do you have any idea how many people he's done this to? She asked. He thought for a moment. There are others, but they're afraid to speak out because they think they'll be punished if they do. That's why we need to rally the community. If we can show that this is happening to many people, we can start to. Ollie had an idea. What if we held a community meeting and invited people who have been through similar things? We could make it safe for them to talk about it. That might work, Steven said, his eyes lighting up. If we can get enough people together, we can put pressure on the department to properly investigate Donnelly. Jamal looked around the room as if he was weighing the risks. I want to help, but I don't know if I can face him again, Alicia said. Just remember that you're not alone. We're all in this together. The more people who come forward, the stronger our case will be. As they talked about logistics, a sense of determination filled the room. They set a date for the meeting with the goal of getting as many people as possible to show up. Jamal agreed to help spread the word, and as they wrapped up, Alicia felt a glimmer of hope. But as they left the community center, her anxiety returned. They had made a plan, but Donnelly was still a threat. On the way back, Alicia looked at Stevens. What are you thinking? She asked him. I just hope we're ready for what's coming, he replied with a frown. Don't take this lying down that night. As Alicia got ready for bed, her mind was racing. The community meeting was coming up, which could mean both change and danger. She double-checked the locks on her doors and looked out the window to make sure no one was watching, but as she got into bed, she was too tired to remember anything. Her dreams were full of the faces of the people they were fighting for the next day. She would get up every morning ready to face whatever came next, ready to find out the truth about Donnelly and stand up to the threats. Little did they know that Donnelly already knew about their plans. He wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when his reputation was on the line. The day of the community meeting came, and everyone was excited to share their stories and form a support network. When it was Jamal's turn to speak, he did so with a steady shaking voice, and others did the same. Donnelly, each story adding weight to their cause as the mood grew tense. Suddenly, a police cruiser pulled up outside, and Donnelly stepped out with a smug look on his face. What's going on here? He yelled, trying to make people afraid. Alicia's heart raced, but she stood tall. We're here to talk about accountability, she said, rallying the crowd with the community united. Alicia realized that fear would not win that day as they stood against Donnelly, ready to fight for their rights. Bring justice to their neighborhood. At that moment, the battle lines were set, but Alicia knew they had each other, which was stronger than any badge or weapon, and they would not back down.